What do you think of when you hear the term ghost hunters? If you're like me, a kid who grew up in the 2000s and spent way too much time watching the Discovery Channel and Sci Fi Channel, you probably think of the TV show by the same name. It ran from 2004 till sometime in the mid 2010s. Apparently, it had a number of reboots on other channels and streaming services since it first went on air. It seems this show about ghosts refuses to die, and the irony isn't lost on me. I haven't watched it since maybe 2010, when I was a freshman in high school, and even then I only watched it sporadically. It was one of those shows I'd flip on during the commercial breaks for other shows that I actually wanted to watch. I couldn't recap a single episode of the show for you, or any of the locations they visited. It's more so the whole premise of the show that stuck with me. 3 or 4 guys run around some abandoned old hotel or prison. They've got temperature gauges and Geiger counters and all sorts of other doohickeys, asking tons of questions and squealing at every creak and thump in the dark. The whole thing is presented as scientific. They're seeking to document definitive proof of paranormal activity through whatever methods of measurement they can imagine. But at the same time, it has heavy anti-academic undertones. The ghost hunting crew has a unique insight that mainstream academia refuses to acknowledge. All those so-called modern educated people disregard paranormal activity only because they're too entrenched in their own materialist, naturalist narrative. In the ghost hunters' eyes, their job is similar to Copernicus. They're not just contributing new data to the current model of understanding our world. They're aiming to tear down the model and introduce a new one that includes ghosts. It's the same sort of pulse you'll find in the Ancient Aliens shows. Of course, most of academia finds such shows laughable, if not frustrating and insulting. The ghost hunters' tactics and only vaguely follow the scientific method. The data they collect is inconclusive, and the explanations they suggest are absurd. And after all, the whole thing was produced as entertainment for 13-year-olds like myself on cable TV. It wasn't meant to actually shake the foundations of academia, just to draw views. But what if there was space in academia for the legitimate study of ghosts? What might that look like? Fortunately, I have a friend who can answer some of those questions. Kit Bauserman is a first-year MA PhD student in American Studies at the College of William and Mary, with scholarly interests varying widely, from monsters and gothic horror to folk religion and superstition. Kit's research focuses on questions of how we conceptualize, interact with, and create monsters and superstition in folk and popular culture. I first met Kit in 2018 at our alma mater, Christopher Newport University. We became friends over our shared love of writing and philosophy. When I started my podcast, I reached out to Kit, knowing we shared a mutual interest in the very niche topic of Appalachian ghost stories. After about 9 months of wrangling schedules, we finally sat down on a Zoom call to talk shop. In September of 2022, Kit published an article titled Seeing and Speaking to Ghosts: Hauntology's Limits for Understanding Ghosts as Beings. It gives a broad survey of the Academy's approach to ghosts over the past few decades, and offers another way of studying them. We'll talk more about that in our interview. I'll let Kit introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the meat and potatoes of their work.
Guess to start, my name is Kit Bauserman. I'm a first-year master's and PhD student at the College of William and Mary in the American Studies department. Primarily what my research is focusing on right now is Appalachian folklore, particularly as it applies to Appalachian ghosts, monsters, and witches. That's kind of the very basics of what I'm doing. Right now for my master's research, I'm really working on a deeper investigation into the role of the black dog ghost, which is a phenomenon that is most popularly associated with Britain, but has appearances throughout the world, namely in the European continent and the North American continent. So I'm basically looking into the religious history and how that influences it and kind of how it occupies a space in the human and folkloric worlds.
Why did you decide that you wanted to do a master's and PhD on this stuff?
Uh, well, so interestingly, this wasn't exactly my topic when I was applying to it. Um, Initially, what I was looking at doing was something more along the lines of like folk music and just kind of general cultural history, which I guess is still kind of what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
But what kind of happened over the summer, I'd initially gotten an acceptance to the University of Alabama's Religion and Culture program, and I wasn't actually originally supposed to be in this program at William and Mary.
Hmm.
So after basically getting denied from this program, Alabama was really open about what you could kind of research. So I decided, you know what, I'm going on a monsters and folklore angle. And it's something I'd been juggling around, but that was the moment I really committed to it. So then after I got the news about William and Mary in May 2022, I had to figure out how to kind of rejuggle everything since I was primarily coming from a religious studies perspective instead of an American studies. So that's what kind of got me into the MA PhD thing. It just kind of happened after the admissions. I wanted to pursue a PhD to get on an academic track.
So you were not originally planning on studying this stuff at an academic level.
I'd thrown the idea around a bunch, but I didn't really feel like I could commit to it because as much of an interest I had in like horror and monsters, just through like what they present on like ghost shows and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
it's always that, there's no real academic interest in this. So I'd kind of fallen into that narrative until I realized, hey, there are ways I can actually approach this
Sure.
from a credible academic standpoint. And when I realized that, I just dove in wholeheartedly. I wanted to do this, but I just never really kind of had the courage to commit to it.
Yeah, what does the difference look like? Because I think when most people think about like studying ghosts or monsters, they think of like Bigfoot hunters and like Discovery Channel shows. And I think your article that we'll talk about probably in just a minute, you talk about the difference between that kind of study and then what you're doing in academia. Like, what is that difference?
So, from what you kind of see on like ghost hunting perspectives, there are really, and as I kind of mentioned in my article, there are two very different goals. Um, Really, with ghost hunters, what they're trying to want to do is really prove the existence of ghosts.
Mm-hmm.
From other things, from other academic standpoints, you can actually have people researching the ghost hunting teams themselves and their activities. So they might be brought on as like an outside member to kind of observe, sort of like how you might have like teaching observations or something, how the principal comes in and takes notes while they kind of do their thing. So there's this article I read called, I think it was called Manifesting Spirits, where basically this person went in and tried to look at how the ghost hunting team really constructed narratives of how paranormal events happened. And with that, it was like, what role did the skeptics have? How much was the team leader playing into this? And really, what was kind of like the legitimation process? So that's one way to study it. I mean, you also have people in certain other disciplines really trying to defend certain perspectives. I'd really kind of more see that in the realm of like, and this isn't put to any one specific religion, that might be more of the realm of like people dealing with it from a theological perspective,
Mm-hmm.
trying to see, hey, I read this given religious text as supporting ghosts. I'm going to collect some additional data as well, kind of like a mixed methods approach. I mean, that's one way it can be done.
Mm-hmm.
This is more or less the angle I'll be taking, the theological approach. Now, let me be clear. The purpose of this podcast is not to prove the existence of ghosts. You won't see me running around Bunnyman Bridge here in Fairfax County with a thermometer and a Ouija board. Nor is it my goal to write a PhD in American Studies on folklore involving ghosts. Kit's got that one covered. I'm instead considering the topic of ghosts from a Christian perspective, which assumes the existence of an unseen world full of spirits and the omniscient, immaterial God of the Bible, who created both the seen and the unseen. As I said in our first episode, my primary concern is making this podcast pastoral and practical. We live in a world full of things we can't explain, and all of us, no matter what you believe about ghosts, have to grapple with the fear of death. I'm a Christian, and I believe the Bible gives the best account for the world we live in and die in. In a future episode, we'll unpack what Christianity has to offer on this topic, both on the reality of the unseen world and the hope we have for life after death. But for now, let's go back to Kit's approach.
And what I do, though, I kind of approach it from a phenomenological perspective, saying, assuming the ghost exists and what people say about, ghosts and monsters are real, what really does kind of that say about the human world they live in, I live in, and what are some kind of lessons that can be gained from that? So my goal is not to prove it exists, but if it exists, then what?
Right.
From a cultural, social, and historical perspective.
Okay, so your focus is more so on the human experience and kind of the cultural and sociological ramifications of experiencing ghosts or the paranormal or the supernatural, rather than studying the ghosts as kind of their own subject. Is that right?
Because I'm very much kind of interested in like subjects of folk belief, for instance, and really kind of like the heterodoxy surrounding that.
Sure.
So like, for instance, something I'm really looking into right now is Christian pietism, and particularly like pietist Lutheranism, and how that really, I'm sort of theorizing about how the convergence of these different denominations really created a culture that allowed superstition to thrive. And when you have a culture that allows superstition to thrive, and maybe there's no specific theology being prescribed to the people, what kind of beliefs form from there, and then what's kind of the experience and thoughts they have after that. So it's not only like, here are the circumstances, but here's the process, what the process builds, and how people experience what that process built.
Sure.
So it's kind of like it's almost really a production line, of folk belief formation and experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating. I have been, one of the classes I'm taking this semester in my program is Christian thought and philosophy. And so we're just starting to broach Kant and Schleiermacher. So we're really seeing the turn, kind of the philosophical shift from an assumption of the immaterial or the supernatural, moving into more modern and postmodern philosophy of an assumption of the material only. That, the empiricist claim that if it can't be observed and studied and measured, then it can't be commented on. Maybe not that it doesn't exist, maybe not going that far, but simply saying that if it's not observable and measurable, it's not meaningful. So it's just interesting that, German pietism and that rise is coalescing with in the academy this growing belief that there's not anything beyond the material world.
Part of the interesting things about that, and like speaking to kind of the academy today, even if we can't, really view the immaterial, we can comment on the material effects of the immaterial.
Okay, interesting.
Which is like, how do we observe the effects of the immaterial in human society, which is kind of where I'm trying to get into this.
Sure.
Also, what kind of happened and what you're really seeing around the time of Kant is actually really the result of a few 100-year process. Um, and I'm only just starting to dig into the literature, but this actually predates the Reformation to where a lot of this was happening.
Okay.
So in the Middle Ages, of course, it's really popular narrative that superstition abounded, and they're not necessarily wrong. That's not a wrong narrative. What happens at the end of the medieval period and the start of the early modern, so we're talking roughly a 50-year span from 1400 to 1450. Really what you're kind of seeing is the clergy trying to disabuse and discipline folk religion, folk belief, and superstition out of the common folk. And there are a lot of different reasons for this. Uh, some is really that, these classes are ignorant and really need to be taught proper Christian ways.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a case in 1500s England where there was actually a lot of accusations thrown at the clergy by the Lollardy League movement, basically saying, hey, y'all aren't even teaching things as basic as the Ten Commandments.
Mm-hmm.
So you're really kind of encouraging superstition this way. So that was part of it. There was really a thought of like ignorance as well. And I actually broke into is the wrong word, but I cracked open the Malleus Maleficarum yesterday.
For the uninitiated, the Malleus Maleficarum is a 15th century German book created by Dominican inquisitors. It was used to identify and punish various forms of sorcery, including witchcraft.
And basically it was talking about how some of the assumptions that like these charms and runes are made with secret words that not even the enchanter knows, that the devil can basically imbue them with secret meanings, so you really don't know what you're getting into. And there's this idea that by engaging with and using like kind of these runes or these charms, that you're forming an implicit and unspoken, and you might not even realize it, but just by doing this you're forming an unspoken pact with the devil. And this was actually an idea that came out of Germany, with the Malleus Maleficarum being written by Heinrich Institutorius, or Heinrich Kramer, as I think was his legal name. But so that was part of it as well. Part of it was being viewed as like some of the remnants of paganism. And after the Reformation, something new that pops up, it's really kind of anti-Catholic sentiment, because of the view of Catholics as being somewhat semi-pagan with their ritual. Not, of course, not fully as bad as what you'd see like just pagan and other religious cults.
Mm-hmm.
But there was definitely an anti-Catholic sentiment in some of that, especially when you see populations that were formerly Catholic, because Germany really didn't exist as a state at this time. It was just a bunch of kingdoms in Germanic land.
Right.
But they kind of shared a common language. But yeah, kind of like Italy when it was broken up into a bunch of states before it was properly unified.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what was happening, because this was after, I think, the breakup of the Holy Roman Empire.
What's the difference between superstition and like spiritual orthodox?
So, I mean, that's kind of the point. Superstition itself is outside of orthodoxy. That's basically one of the big categories. Now, you can use superstition in a variety of ways. You can use it as basically, I was looking up the definition on Google the other day because I'm approaching it from like a folkloric technical standpoint in some of my works.
Mm-hmm.
Like a technical term in that case, but really what I saw on Google, it's really the excessive belief in supernatural cause. So kind of one of the things that's interesting, and when I was looking at the Malleus Maleficarum, there's basically this belief going all the way back to St. Augustine that supernatural causes are more often illusions.
Right.
Devils and demons really cannot transform the human body or the human soul. If they do, it's only temporary or an illusion. I'd kind of done some looking into werewolves on that, and that was what kind of brought me back to St. Augustine. But it's really kind of like this excessive attribution to causes other than God is, I guess, what you could kind of say.
Okay.
Um, if you really want to boil it down to it, or the increasing role of humanity, it's not necessarily always demonic forces, but it's the increasing role of human engagement in the supernatural rather than heavenly engagement.
I
If you
see.
want.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that's really helpful. I think a lot of people today, when they hear superstition, they would even consider belief in God to be superstitious because that association is anything that is not within the material world would be considered, you know, false and superstitious. I think those two assumptions go together.
Kind of going back, part of the way I personally kind of refute this idea of like, positivism, materialism, and empiricism, really it's the significance of something that matters. It's not really if it can be tested for or affirmed by, scientific instruments, but if it's really significant to someone and causes change for them, that's really what makes it something worth studying. And that's kind of
Gotcha.
how I approach it. Sure, I might not be able to prove something prove something changes, like say, hey, there's a spirit off screen and I'll pull up a temperature gauge to show that in this spot over here it's 20 degrees less than the surrounding area.
Mm-hmm.
But still, it's very much the significance aspect of that is something big for me in how I study.
Cool. When did that become like a legitimate avenue in academia?
Um, this idea that I was talking about, or just really kind of my own work.
Both, like the idea of studying immaterial paranormal things, since for so long that was probably heavily stigmatized within academia. Now it seems like there's a legitimate avenue to study that.
So I think an important thing to bring up with this, a lot of this also really evolves out of just proper theology,
Mm-hmm.
or not proper theology, but theology proper as a discipline.
Yeah, yeah.
Because that's really dealing with the immaterial and supernatural on a whole realm. It's really kind of the intervention of various gods or God into the human realm. So really this kind of evolves out of theology. Now, later down the road, you'll see kind of a split between religious studies and theology.
Right.
One of the ways it's popularly regarded is that theology involves almost a religious commitment, whereas religious studies, you're kind of just observing the phenomenons without necessarily trying to defend them.
Sure.
I'm not sure how exactly I think about that because, you can study theology of another faith you're not necessarily a part of. So it might even just be a trivial distinction,
Mm-hmm.
but that's just kind of how the academy has taken it so far. Whereas you're basically studying the phenomenon versus trying to really like get into the beliefs and argue for or against or try to understand them.
Gotcha.
So yeah, one, you're getting deep into the ideas and thought around them. The other, you're kind of getting into the beliefs and how they manifest in wider culture. It's like I said, it's very tenuous when you kind of look at it under a microscope. Um, but I mean that I'd say really a lot of it kind of evolves out of theology and its kind of canonization as a proper discipline. Because something that I was sure was talked about in your classes at CNU, but also mine, philosophy of religion was really kind of like the first academic study.
Mm-hmm.
So everything's really just kind of branched off from that in a way. So you could almost kind of argue that, maybe it's never started being something, it always was. There have just been kind of shifts in the wider culture around empiricism and rationalism.
Sure.
Um, and again, for me, I think part of something and why this has become more interesting, really after 2021, you're seeing the rise of people moving away from organized religion as a whole into really, I don't think it be wrong to just call it straight up witchcraft as a religious phenomenon or organization, because that's how a lot of them self identify. And you'll see the rise of the nuns as well.
That's spelled Nones, not Nuns. These nuns are people who do not identify with any particular organized religion. Their beliefs are self-described as spiritual but not religious, and they're often eclectic, drawing from Eastern philosophy, Western paganism, shamanism, New Age mysticism, and various kinds of superstition. Two easy examples you may have noticed is the explosion of interest in astrology and crystals.
So religion's always played a very important part in the public sphere, and with these changing cultural trends, I'd say that's might be part of the reason why there's a look at it again, but also just really from an entertainment and media perspective as well. I mean, look at really the rise of ghost shows.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a phenomenon on its own. Finding Bigfoot on, let's see, Animal, was that on Animal Planet or was that different?
I think it was Animal Planet.
Yeah, maybe for a while, but then I think it also transitioned to Discovery or something.
Discovery's the hub of most of that stuff.
Yeah, but that's kind of my point. It's basically a channel, because I remember the mermaid documentary they aired when I was probably somewhere between like 11 and 13. I was convinced of that for a while. Like one of my oldest memories with TV was the Thunderbird episode of Lost Tapes.
Mm,
Might have been the single thing, if you want to put it, that got me into this.
yeah,
Like the found footage media craze, Blair Witch. I mean, people were always just kind of a sucker for this.
sure, yeah.
Look back to the spiritualism movement of the mid 19th century. I mean, it's kind of, what do you take away from religious orthodoxy? And there was kind of like a scientific rationalism around that, which, I mean, earlier with the Malleus Maleficarum, it was really, hey, what are kind of the scientific means of tracking down witches? I mean, really, it's just kind of gone through cycles of cultural relevance and irrelevancy and never's really disappeared.
I distinctly remember that show about mermaids on the Discovery Channel. I can't remember if that coincided with Shark Week or if it was something different, but my brother was obsessed with that.
Yeah, and it convinced like such a strange amount of people, and like that's probably something I want to go back and look at eventually, because like media is, it's not my main focus, but it's something I kind of like to dabble with,
Mm-hmm.
especially a lot of like digital media and digital folklore. But yeah, that Lost Tapes, Blair Witch Project, like all that sort of found footage media, like monsters never lost their relevance.
Yeah. I've always been fascinated with like cryptids, like Bigfoot. In fifth grade, I was obsessed with Bigfoot.
I mean, I actually went on, well, my dad and I had planned to go on one point on a Bigfoot hunting trip, because we both watched Finding Bigfoot together almost religiously. We've seen every episode of it. But with that, actually, around my hometown, on my street in Woodstock, Virginia, I'd actually heard a number of strange things, and I'm sure I've told you this story, but I'm just going to tell it again for the podcast, just since it's kind of relevant to how I got into this.
Sure.
Um, so there were a few times I tried like knocking on trees and heard like knocks back from way off in the distance, but like after there was time for an echo. But really the biggest event for me, so basically where my childhood home was, um, we were kind of on like this weird giant hill slash plateau, and like you could view the mountains off in the back, but there were like these series of ridges covered in pretty densely packed wood, and they were like really high hills going into really deep valleys, but like the valleys were only like 5 to 6 feet across. So me, my sister, my neighbor Isaac went over across the street to my friend William's house, and we actually tried to see how many hills we could climb over. Well, when we got to the third, we heard this really loud screeching sound, which, if you want to bring it up and then like include a sound bite in like post production, it sounded exactly like an elk bugle call.
Your wish is my command, Kit. Here's the elk.
elk don't live in that region of Virginia.
No, they don't.
Like they'd been reintroduced in maybe roughly around the same time to Southwest Virginia, but this was like right around the time they'd been reintroduced. So they couldn't have really traveled up this far to, right in between Winchester and Harrisonburg. Um, they weren't around. My sister and neighbors said they thought it sounded like a door screech, but we were too far into the woods to hear that. I don't really know what it was, but yeah, that was, I think, also one of the big things that just caused me to seek this out and have such a fascination with it.
Mm. Let's talk a bit about specifically Appalachian phenomena and Appalachian ghost stories. I mean, I personally have a connection with that because my grandfather grew up in Roanoke. My grandma's from West Virginia, and both of them have their own stories and stories of friends who had encounters with, they call them spirits or specters or ghosts. But what has your research been in that area?
So, as I've kind of talked about, the real research I've started with has to do with this thing called the dog ghost, or really they're just kind of known as black dogs, but can be entities that are either physical or spectral.
Interesting.
Um, so there's an interesting story I want to pull out from Botetourt County. There's actually this story I found from the 1600s there. And basically, what had happened, this woman had gone away while this woman's husband had basically gone into the area to build up a home for her. And about 8 years later, she came trying to look for her husband. Well, before she came back, there had been sightings of this large black dog, and a lot of them are said to be right around the size of like a donkey or mule, so way larger than any dog has any right being, even a Great Dane, even the largest Great Danes. Um, but they had seen it walking back and forth around 200 feet on this one side of the road. And what happened was they shot at it, threw sticks at it, but it didn't seem phased at all. It just kept walking back and forth until one day this man's wife came, and she goes up to the dog. It recognizes her and leads her up the hill to this area where several stones have been piled up. She yells to the men with her, "Go grab shovels." They do, and they start digging. And what they find there is a skeleton of a man and his dog. And by this point, the dog had disappeared. They couldn't find it anywhere. So she went, properly reburied them, and the dog wasn't seen again.
Hmm.
So, one of the interesting things I've noted, and something I want to dig into deeper, and I'm going to be digging a bit into in my master's thesis, is really how the strange number of non-physical black dog sightings in uh, Virginia and West Virginia specifically, because that's like my special area of interest within Appalachia since I grew up. But so that's the big thing. Like you see a lot of spectral dogs.
Hmm.
Um, but I mean, for some interesting stories, I've come across a number. Like there's one right outside of Harrisonburg where I was living for the past 9 months before I moved here. We're basically on the road between Harrisonburg and Bridgewater. There was this strange shadow that was seen lurking across the road around Christmas time, sometime in the early 20th century. Well, what happened was these men actually went out to go and wrestle it because they were bringing someone along the side of the road and they thought it was suspicious. That shadow overpowered them.
Hmm.
It held them down and they couldn't move until eventually it just disappeared. And so yeah, there are a lot of strange things about, you know, ghosts and such in Appalachia, the Shenandoah Valley. Post I There are these things on like folklore Twitter where you'll have like a certain hashtag for the day of the week and you can like say facts. Well, something I did for, I think it might have been hashtag Faustian Friday. Um, what I did was I was talking about how in the Shenandoah Valley specifically, there are a lot of ghosts that seem to be able to like strangely interact with the physical world. You have people wrestling with like that shadow, or some people who had shot at alleged demons, appearances of fireballs. There's an incredible range. Um, you can't really pin down Appalachian ghost stories to like a single thing because legends vary from holler to holler, or really, as someone also studying Appalachian folk magic, you'll have traditions that vary from family to family.
Mm,
There's just it's incredibly rich oral tradition. But those are just a few of the stories I've encountered.
yeah, fascinating. All right, this isn't immediately relevant to anything we've been talking about, but I think it'd be interesting. Um, Looking at the article that you wrote.
As a reminder, this is Kit's article titled Seeing and Speaking to Ghosts, Hauntology's Limits for Understanding Ghosts as Beings. The link to the article is in the description of this episode, but let me read you the first paragraph to give you a taste. The Academy is haunted. In the 1990s, literary and cultural criticism took a spectral turn, a term coined by literary scholar Roger Lookhart to describe his field's increasing obsession with ghosts and haunting. This preoccupation with the spectral grew to such an extent that by the mid-2000s, it became a field in its own right, termed spectrality studies, by Gothic scholar Jeffrey Andrews Weinstock. This field draws its name from Jacques Derrida's Spectres of Marx, which explains hauntology, a, quote, haunted ontology, unquote, that describes a culture's inability to escape its past, much like the West fails to escape the specter of Marx. Though spectrality studies is an interdisciplinary field that has seen much success, it has its limits. To most spectral scholars, a ghost is a metaphor, or an analytic frame. As such, spectrality and hauntology have little use in the fields of anthropology or ethnography. However, reconsidering the ghost and encountering it as an actual ghost or as a being provides scholars more significant insight into social, cultural, and political structures that the spectral cannot hope to uncover. Let's hear more from Kit.
Can you talk a little bit about Derrida and hauntology? Like,
Yeah.
where did that come from? What is that about? I know that's different than what you're trying to do, but it provides some academic background.
So basically, for some context, Derrida wrote this book called Spectres of Marx in the early 1990s, which was dealing with how the West had really never overcome communism and had to repeatedly re-encounter and deal with it. And that title was actually drawn from the first line of the Communist Manifesto. There's a specter haunting Europe, the specter of communism. And I also realized I unintentionally drew from that in my article when I said the Academy is haunted. But basically, what hauntology has to deal with is this idea of re-encountering cultural and sociological ghosts, not really in the sense of, like a dead person or a specter, but really like these ideas and anxieties that don't go away. So that's kind of where hauntology kind of was developed. Uh, what happened with that, there was an incident while Derrida was working on this book, um, where he had briefly talked with actress Pascale Augier, and he recalled seeing her on film after her death, and basically had talked about the feeling that her specter wasn't leaving him alone. And it really wasn't, again, the literal ghost of the actress, but this idea about her and seeing her and re-encountering her.
Mm-hmm.
And within it, he also talks about these ideas of the specter and the ghost. The specter kind of has something different to where they're it's almost kind of like a missing puzzle piece. It's not there, but I use it to talk about a conspicuous absence in the article. So you can tell it's not there, and by it not being there, it kind of comes back to haunt you in a sense. And to like kind of give an example, because I realize this is a lot of academic and philosophy I'm throwing around. Going back to Alabama, there was something that happened. It started about 2 weeks before I was to start at William and Mary. So I saw these pictures of the people that had been there and who I was supposed to be a part of the same cohort as. And there was this knowledge of knowing I was supposed to be in those photos.
Mm.
You know, I was supposed to be there with them until this strange circumstance happened. And, you know, I had my own absence coming back at me. And it was really like being haunted by my own ghost or my own specter. So you can really equate it to knowing you were supposed to go to an event, something happened last minute, and seeing all the photographs of the event. You know you were supposed to be there. You know you were supposed to be in those videos and experiencing everything. So it's really this idea of this conspicuous absence and being confronted with the past.
Mm-hmm.
Just without getting into all the technical terms, that's
Sure.
kind of what hauntology is about.
So in your article, toward the end, you are in dialogue with Anderson and Whitehead about the multi-natural perspective. Could you explain that a bit? Like, what is that multi-natural perspective?
So something a bit more immediately understandable and something I draw on in the article is bringing in this idea of animal studies, particularly like human animal studies, which is basically one of the key things of it. And there's a line that's always stuck with me. What is a rabbit beyond human meaning? Like separate from the human world, what are the fundamental qualities of a rabbit? What does it mean to be a rabbit? What is rabbitness?
Mm-hmm.
So it's really kind of understanding, you know, how would a rabbit view a human instead of how a human views a rabbit, and could say ghosts or other beings view humans as a human might view that rabbit. It's really kind of stepping outside of the realm of human being and kind of looking back on the human and really learning and kind of realizing that, like animals, ghosts, monsters of all kinds might have realities, thoughts, and experiences of their own that human meaning can't necessarily understand, but also that sometimes just doesn't have to deal with the human. So just understanding what is a monster like an animal apart from the human world, how does the monster view and interact with the world?
Mm-hmm. So in one sense, it's almost like a thought exercise from the perspective of the animal looking to the human experience?
Looking both to the human experience and kind of understanding the animal in its own right.
Okay.
Something very important to understand about animal studies as a whole is it's not really a coalesced field or even method. It is, I'd argue, almost as diverse or even more diverse than American studies as a discipline. It's a bunch of approaches under a common name dealing with a relatively common subject.
Okay.
So that's just the strain I approach it from in this article. But, you know, something as well, you might want to look at, like, say, arguments from animal activism to help understand this.
Okay.
Really looking at the ways of people talking about how these animals are cramped, they're not living how they're supposed to be, but also say like the fear they experience and the emotions and thoughts they'd experience while in like slaughterhouses and stuff. So kind of trying to really just tap into that inner world, and really within this tap into that inner world and what it might have to do with the human world.
Interesting. So is there like, I guess from that perspective, right, from an animal activist, some might criticize that as just anthropomorphization, saying that you are assuming some kind of consciousness upon an animal that we either have no evidence of or people simply deny. Is there kind of uh, an assumption beneath that sort of animal study of something maybe akin to a soul or a consciousness with animals?
All right. So something to particularly note, a lot of this ideas of like animals is not really having consciousness or souls. Um, it can go back even as far as like Aristotle, with his great chain of being, but really kind of the key figure is Rene Descartes. He kind of talks about animals as like an automata that is capable of responding to the outside environment, but really has no thoughts or feeling or inner life on its own. It's just something that can kind of move and interact with the environment. So that's kind of where you get this idea. But number one, with the increasing realms of science, number one, just as a basic thing, we can see animals experience pain. That's really kind of the first intervention. Well, if an animal can experience pain, what else can they experience? Can they experience fear? Uh, we see animals running from humans. Do you want to call that a basic instinct? I mean, humans have basic instincts of fear as well. So, what's kind of really the line? Are we also automata in some senses? So, I mean, it's really once you start asking a simple question of like, do they experience pain? It opens up a lot of floodgates. I mean, you also want to look at, say, dogs, for instance, and how they can kind of really sense and emulate the feelings of their owners as well. So there's might be an anthropomorphization, but I mean, that's also, I argue, as a counterpoint as well, saying that there's kind of this assumption and projection is also an anthropocentric um, kind of idea, saying that are humans really the only ones? Because you're kind of assuming a lot by saying that humans are the only ones that experience these things.
Sure.
To say they experience them does not necessarily say that they experience them the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So that would kind of be a counterpoint. I mean, it's kind of something with like language and metaphor and comparison. Say for instance, we need to recharge our batteries after, say, an introvert's out for a while. We don't literally plug ourselves in. There's a common language being used, but that doesn't necessarily mean the experience is necessarily the same.
Sure. Um, Applying that now to the study of ghosts and the immaterial. You note in your article there are some distinct differences between human animal studies and how we might apply that to the study of immaterial subjects. What does that look like?
So, as I kind of note, number one in that, outside of theology and maybe the hard sciences, again, the goal is not to prove or, yeah, the goal is not to really prove the existence of the ghost by any means. But with that, so that kind of removes kind of like some of the scientific branches,
Sure.
which you'll see in like animal studies, the whole human animal studies is kind of like a specific trend within that I'm drawing on. But really applying that to the spectral, I mean, I actually want to go back to your earlier episode of this podcast, which I really loved. Your grandfather, in that sense, talks about these ghosts gathering around his bed, and he kind of speculates on the idea of, what are these ghosts thinking for what this person is doing in their home, or, what are the experiences they're having? Is this sort of eternal restlessness a type of punishment? So it's kind of very much what he was doing in that, you know, speculating on what those ghosts are experiencing, what their thoughts are, and what that can also mean for the human realm in terms of religion. Like, is hell really just not necessarily, say, this idea of like a fiery pit, but just a lack of rest,
Mm.
eternal work in some sense? And obviously, these are not, you know, or theologically orthodox ideas I'm throwing around. It's just kind of a language exercise in pinpointing, but it's very much kind of the same thing of what he did that I'm doing. You're just kind of speculating, what does that mean for human religion, culture, thought, of with what they're experiencing, trying to look outside the human perspective and really that outside looking in.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I appreciate, I think, the exploration of the spectral for the sake of living in this world. Like looking again to my grandfather, like his experience of these ghosts or spirits standing around him asking him these questions led him to deeply consider and worry about, will that be me one day?
Mhm.
And that's a fascinating implication, that like these experiences that people have really do shape the way that they live and operate in our world.
Yeah, it shapes how they live and operate in this world and think about and prepare for the next.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, from just a purely religious perspective, that's the significance right there.
Our conversation started to ramble off at this point, and we even shared our own stories of encountering the unseen world. I'm not going to include those stories in this episode, though you can find the whole uncut interview with Kit on YouTube, following the link below, and I'll likely add them in future episodes. As we wrapped up, Kit said something profound that stuck with me.
I do think there's an important element to kind of note from my own research as well, and how I'm approaching this. Well, I'm writing about this from a certain perspective. At the same time, I'm also just a person deeply interested in the supernatural. So I go after these and try to experience the same things necessarily like some of the ghost hunters do. I'm inhabiting two roles at once. It's just, what face do I allow to show up at which points? I mean, it's a lot of personal experience and deeply personal interest. I want to really physically experience this so I can write about it better and how other people experience it.
Hmm.
So there doesn't necessarily have to be a separation of roles. You can use the ghost hunter you to inform the academic you. I mean, there's really not much of a need of separation. It's
Sure.
just what's the dominant mode at the time. In some ways, it's kind of a similar task to say what the theologian does. I'm not necessarily trying to equate them. I'm
Mm-hmm.
just saying similar modes of existence where you live and write out your religion, study it to try and understand it and practice it better. In some cases, again, not every case, but in some cases, that's very much the same thing of what people like myself are trying to do. I go out on these ghost tours, I collect this folklore to understand the culture in the area I grew up in, to kind of connect with my past and preserve it all at the same time, but just understand this wider world I'm living in that's inhabited by more than what I can always see.
Kit is a dear friend, and I commend them on their academic journey. And they're right. As a student of theology, I've got a personal connection with the content that I handle. It's not just a career or a field of study. It's a chance to explore and better inhabit the world we all live in. In our next few episodes, in no particular order, we're going to explore other approaches to understanding that unseen world. One approach will follow the philosophical discipline of phenomenology, focusing in on the encounter with the holy other, beings or forces beyond ourselves. We want to look at what it actually feels like to encounter one of these things. Another approach will be more in the lane of biblical studies, surveying the Old Testament and New Testament and other ancient Near Eastern impressions of ghosts. Yet another will be a more systematic theological approach, coming up out of the trees of biblical stories to view the whole forest of Christianity. And finally, we'll take a personal turn and consider some pastoral implications. Why does all of this matter? And what comfort might we find in light of the gospel? My hope is to have more guest appearances who can speak with more authority than myself. And I've already got one person lined up, but we'll have to wait and see. Until then, my name is Patrick Quinn. This has been a Take Note of This podcast. You can follow us at takenoteofthis.org. Thanks for listening.